I want to begin today with a very simple question, really. The question is, what does it look like to be truly devoted to Jesus? What does that actually look like? Truly devoted. You know, does the fact that you came to church today and you sat in this room, does that equal devotion? Serious question. Does that equal devotion? I would argue that can be one of the signs that you're devoted. Absolutely, that can be one of the signs that you're devoted. But in and of itself, I would say no. No, simply decreasing the distance between your body and the church doors does not equal devotion. You know, it can be one of the signs, but it does not equal devotion on its own. So, and how do we know that? How do we know that simply coming to church and parking yourself, how do we know that that does not equal devotion? Well, Judas. Judas is how we know that. Judas, during Jesus' ministry, Judas was about as physically close to Jesus as you could get. Judas was right there for all of it. He was just as close to Jesus as any of the other disciples were. Judas was right there. He saw all the miracles. He heard all the teachings. He was there for the Sermon on the Mount. He was there for the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Judas heard and saw everything. Judas was in the room. There was very little physical distance between Judas and Jesus. He was right there. But in terms of devotion, Judas was miles away, wasn't he? And you know how we know that? Well, stories like we're going to see today, but also what did Judas eventually do? Judas eventually sold out Jesus, didn't he? So then what does devotion to Jesus look like? What does it actually look like? Well, I think one of the best ways to answer that question is to look at the two main players in today's story, the story that we're going to look at in just a minute. And those two people are going to be Judas. Judas is one of them. But the other one is also Mary, the sister of Lazarus. Remember, we've met her before. We recently encountered her in the story of the raising of Lazarus. Those are the two main players in today's story. Both of them are within arm's reach of Jesus in the story. Both of them. But one is close in distance only. The other is close in devotion and distance. And that makes the difference. So I titled today's sermon, Devotion Over Distance. Because I want to stress the idea that Jesus wants more from us than just our physical presence. He wants more for us than to just show up and be close. We're going to see three ways today that Mary showed her devotion. That's what we're looking at. And my advice is, in a world of Judases, be a Mary. Okay, we're in our household. We're all a bunch of Little House on the Prairie fans, and if you've ever seen Little House on the Prairie, we've got this little cross-stitched bag or something. It says, "In a world of Nellies, be a Laura." If you know the people, you know you get it. In a world of Nellies, be a Laura. But my advice to you today is, in a world of Judases, be a Mary. Be a Mary. We're going to see what that means in a minute. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and flip with me to the Gospel of John, chapter 12. Today we're going to be reading verses 1 through 8. A very short passage, but ripe with meaning. John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. And the word of the Lord says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, because what else is she going to do? Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. So, since we're talking about devotion today, just to make sure we're all on the same page, just to make sure we're all understanding this the same, before we analyze the text, let's just take a moment and define that term. Let's just define it. Here's what I consider to be the best definition I've looked at all week that I think best sums up what I'm trying to get across today. And here's a definition of devotion that I particularly appreciate. It says to give oneself wholeheartedly to a person, task, or belief, signifying steadfast commitment and perseverance. All right, for you note takers in there, just to drag this out for another second, to give oneself wholeheartedly to a person, task, or belief, indicate or signifying steadfast commitment and perseverance. That's what I mean today whenever I talk about devotion. So, let me encourage you. Let me encourage you with something. I do want you to pay attention as we start to break this down. Pay attention to how verses 1 through 8, this tiny little section that we just read today, they're directing our attention. I mean, the very structure of the passage is directing our attention toward the actions of Mary and Judas. They're put right up against each other. It's right there in the structure of the passage. But specifically, the point is to see how these actions reveal what's inside of each of them. Their actions reveal what's inside their hearts. And specifically, the contrast between them, because it's two very different attitudes, two very different actions. One is fully devoted, one is not. And as we compare how they both reacted, we're going to see the difference. Remember, I made this point a few weeks ago in another sermon. I said, anybody can say they believe anything. Anybody can say they believe anything. It's what you do. It's what you do that reveals the truth of it. What you do is where the proof is. That's how you know what's really inside of you. And so let's see what they're doing. Let's see what they do in this story. It's only 8 verses, but again, it reveals a lot about their beliefs, their attitudes, and even their devotion levels to Jesus. Or in Judas's case, lack of devotion. All right, so let's look at this. In the structure, it's very simple. It's a very simple structure, but it really heightens the point John's trying to make. In verses 1 through 2, we get the setting. We find out the when and the where. This is taking place 6 days before the Passover, which means, I mean, if you're doing the math, we're only 6 days out from the crucifixion at this point. Like, we're getting close. Jesus' time is near. And so we're 6 days out from this Passover, and then we also get the place, or at least the setting. It's this dinner party being thrown to honor Jesus. And some of the guests are mentioned, and it's Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and so that might make you think that they're the ones hosting this party, but in actuality, they're not. If you look at the parallel story to this one over in Matthew chapter 26, Matthew tells us that this story is taking place at the home of a man known as Simon the leper. Simon, not leopard, he's not a big cat. The leper. Leper is in leprosy. All right, this guy used to have leprosy. You know how we know he used to have it and he doesn't still have it? Because if he still had it, they wouldn't be eating dinner at his house. So how would you like to have had this horrible skin condition and you're still known as Simon the leper? But that's his lot in life. He's forever marked as Simon the leper. But the theory is Jesus healed this guy at some point. And that's why he's so keen on hosting a dinner party in Jesus' honor when he finds out Jesus is coming back to his hometown. Why else would he open his home up to him? But he does. And we see the guest list includes Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. Martha's doing what she always does. She's serving. The church needs people that are always willing to roll up their sleeves and serve and work. She's working. She's serving. Lazarus is at the table with Jesus. And then Mary comes into the picture. And that's in verse 3, that's where we get Mary's actions. What is Mary doing in this story? Well, it's right there. It says, she therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed Jesus's feet with this. So she took this expensive oil, this expensive perfume, and she pours it over Jesus's feet. It says a pound. And this is a Roman pound. This is not like in America, when we talk about a pound, we're talking about 16 ounces. This is a Roman pound, which is closer to 12 ounces. It's 327 grams to be exact, and that'll come into play in a minute, believe me. I'm not just throwing out numbers for the sake of it here. But she takes a pound of this oil and pours it over Jesus's feet. And we're going to see in a minute, this makes somebody pretty mad. Well, this oil, this particular type of oil, this nard oil, this oil is made from a particular plant called the spikenard, which was grown in the mountains of India and harvested there and then imported into Jerusalem and other places. But this stuff is very, very expensive. They would often dilute it with other additives to make it more cost efficient, to make it go further, stretch out its usefulness, but also to cheapen it and make it more affordable. But in its pure form, this stuff was very, very expensive, as we're going to see in a minute when Judas starts running his mouth. But John makes it a point to tell us this is the pure stuff. This is the undiluted, pure stuff. And she anoints it with him, and she gets down on her feet, by his feet, basically on her face, and she's anointing him with this oil. And then she does something really interesting. She lets her hair down to sop up the excess. And we're going to break all this down shortly. But just before we get there, I just want you to be thinking about the extreme humility that's involved in getting down on the ground like that, on her face in front of Jesus. And we're going to see the significance of the hair in a minute too. But what I just want to leave you with before we kind of move on to Judas is just the devotion of the moment. The devotion of the moment as she is on her face in front of the one and only Jesus. And then who comes into the scene in verses 4 through 6? We see Judas's reaction to Mary's actions. And what does he do? He gets mad. He gets mad. He starts complaining. We see that in verse 5 and 6. He says, starting in verse 5, he says, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Now, John tells us in verse 6, he gives us a little snippet here, a little commentary that says he didn't say this because he cared about the poor. In fact, there's no record anywhere in the Bible of Judas ever giving money to the poor. Ever. But John makes it a point to tell us, guess what Judas did do? He was the treasurer for the disciples. He was the one who held the money. And what did he do with that money? Well, he used to help himself to it sometimes, hoping that the people doing the bookkeeping wouldn't catch that, he's helping himself to the money. Of course, he's going to think to himself, man, I wish that 300 denarii was in the money bag. That's just more money for him. That's more money for him to help himself to. And in case you're wondering, denarii, that is the plural term of the word denarius. A denarius was the equivalent of about 1 day's worth of wages in those times. If you were a laborer and you went out into somebody's field and worked for 1 day, you were going to get paid 1 denarius. That was a 1 day's worth of a wage. Look what Judas is saying here. This could have been sold for 300 denarii. All right, that is an annual salary for a laborer in those days. There were 300 working days in their calendar. Why 300? Well, 6 days a week. All right, we don't work on Sabbath, so 6 days a week times 52 weeks a year, minus the feasts and the festivals and all those times we wouldn't be working. You had about 300 working days. So Judas is saying this oil that you just poured on his feet is worth an annual salary. We could have sold this. We could have given this to the poor. Why are you pouring it on his feet? And then John makes it a point to let us know they wouldn't have known this then, but they clearly figured it out eventually that he had been stealing money. He said, no, Judas wasn't, he didn't care about the poor. Judas cared about lining his pockets. That's what he's mad about. So he starts fussing at Mary. He complains. He's got this impure motive. And then in verses 7 and 8, we see Jesus' response to Judas's reaction to Mary's actions. And Jesus, he chastises Judas. He doesn't chastise Mary. He tells Judas, you stop it. He says, leave her alone. That's what he says. He says, leave her be, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. That might seem like a strange thing to say. She can keep it when she already poured it out. And there's a lot of people like talking about what exactly he's referring to. I tend to think what Jesus is just saying here is, don't take this moment away from her. Let her keep this. Let her keep this memory. She just did something very special. And if you go read all the parallel accounts in the other Gospels, because this is recorded in other Gospels as well, Jesus even says, she did this to anoint me for my burial. We're alluding to the fact here that Jesus is about to die. He's been trying to tell them this. They're still not quite getting it. And if you remember, when you died in those days and you were buried, they anointed you with oils and spices. Jesus is saying, this is for my impending burial. He's alluding to his death, which is coming up. And he says, don't take this from her. She let this be kept for the day of my burial. So he actually chastises Judas. Poor Mary. I said this already. Every time we see Mary, she's always on her feet by Jesus. We saw it in the raising of Lazarus story a few weeks ago. You see it in the other story in Luke when Martha gets mad at her, and somebody's always mad at her. All she wants to do is worship Jesus, and somebody's always mad at her. And Jesus is always sticking up for her. That's my favorite part, is when Martha was fussing at Mary, Jesus said, you leave her alone. And now Judas is fussing at her, and Jesus is saying, leave her alone. But here's the key point I need you to see in all of this. Both Mary and Judas are in the same room with Jesus. They're both in the room. Just like we're all in the same room right now. We're all in this room together, aren't we? They're both in the same room with Jesus. But only one of them is really devoted to Jesus. Only one. And so like when it comes to Jesus and when it comes to Jesus' church, you can be physically close. You can enter the room, but you can still be spiritually very, very far away. You can come close physically, but still be miles away spiritually. Right now, all across America, probably the world, but I think America is probably the worst. All across America, people are meeting in churches where there is very little distance between them physically, between them and between the body of Christ, but devotionally, they're miles away from everybody else. Miles away. You can't always tell where somebody's heart is just by where they happen to be sitting. And so we got to separate the distance from the devotion. And we can't just draw near in terms of distance. We have to draw near in terms of devotion. We have to draw near in our devotion to Jesus and his devotion to the church. We have to put devotion over distance. Hence the title of the sermon. Devotion is what we're talking about. And don't overlook the fact, like I already pointed out, that Jesus refused to fuss Mary for what she did, for her act of devotion. He actually defended her. The one he fussed was Judas. But he frequently fussed at people in the Gospels, and usually it's the religious leaders. Usually they're the ones he's fussing at. And I also do want you to remember that one of his most scathing criticisms of those religious leaders was when he said, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus wants devotion, not just distance. So let's look at, with the rest of our time that we have here, let's look at 3 ways that Mary showed her devotion to Jesus in this passage and what we can learn from those 3 ways. Number 1, the first one, Mary showed her devotion by her willingness to humble herself. I know that sounds like a generic statement, but go with me here. She showed her devotion by her willingness to humble herself. This was a society where touching somebody's feet was about the most demeaning thing you could do. If you respected yourself in any capacity, the last thing you ever wanted to do was touch somebody's feet. That was the lowest of the low. If you were fortunate enough to have enough money that you could hire people to work for you and you had servants, or if you were one of the people in those days who even owned slaves, that was a job you gave to the servants, and that was a job you gave to the slaves, was when the guest comes into my house, clean their feet. Because you weren't going to do it. They were coming in with dirty feet, believe me, because they're walking around in sandals on dirt, sandy streets and dirt and stuff like that. They're coming in with dirty feet. Somebody's got to clean those feet. That fell to the servants. If you respected yourself in any capacity, you didn't touch somebody's feet. Mary had no problem getting down on the ground at the feet of Jesus. So right away, we see her humbling herself. She gets on the ground. She voluntarily placed herself in the lowest possible position. The lowest position she could place herself, she did. But not just in a general sense. It wasn't just that she put herself on the ground. She put herself on the ground at the feet of the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. She put herself on the ground at the feet of Jesus. His feet were the feet that she took. His feet. The lowest position she could put herself in relation to him, she did. It's not just that she humbled herself and she exalted Jesus at the same time. She humbled herself and exalted him at the exact same time. She didn't just make herself small, she made Jesus big. She made him really big. And I hope you're getting John the Baptist vibes here. Remember, JTB, he said it first. He must decrease. Well, no, backwards. Don't ever say that about Jesus. He must increase. I must decrease. Those were John's words. I hope you're getting those vibes here. And I'll say this. One thing that drives me nuts is when I will listen to other preachers. Not any preacher, but certain ones. But when I listen to these other preachers sometimes, and I hear these guys, they go on and they go on and they go on 35 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever, and all they're doing is they're talking about themselves. They've got all the stories, they've got all the illustrations. It's all about them. It's all about them. Their sermon is just a bunch of stories about themselves. You know, I'm not trying to prop myself up here, but I try to ground everything in this word right here. And I hear these guys, and all they're doing is telling all their funny stories. And it's their experiences, and it's their thoughts. And if you're lucky, maybe somewhere in the midst of all that, they'll throw in a verse or two of Scripture, which could have been any verse or two of Scripture, because it doesn't even, it's just kind of tacked on, so it almost doesn't even matter what it is. They make sure to sprinkle it with all the Christian buzzwords. But if you listen closely, they're not exalting Jesus, they're exalting themselves. I'll tell you a story a time or two about myself. I like wrestling. All these things about me. But that's never the centerpiece with me. But I hear them and I think about this, and then I see Mary in this story today, and then I think about JTB saying, JTB was a preacher. JTB preached, but JTB preached, he must increase, I must decrease. That was his message. That was what he was talking about. Remember, again, the true meaning of humility. The true meaning of humility. And we talked about this when we were doing the purpose-driven life. We talked about this. Humility isn't just thinking less of yourself. That's actually not humility. Humility is just thinking of yourself less. You don't have to think less of yourself. You just think of yourself less. So what are you thinking about then? Well, Jesus first, others second, and yourself last. That's humility. That's humility. And what is Mary doing right now? She's on her face in front of all these people, putting herself last. Remember, one of the calls of a disciple is to die to self. That's literally what Jesus said, die to self. In Luke chapter 9, verse 23. This is the passage, bar none, for this concept where you have to die to self. Luke 9:23, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. That's Jesus' words. In Galatians 2:20, Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live. He says, but rather Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. It's this idea of dying to self, putting yourself last, humbling yourself. Devotion starts with humility. It starts with humility. And humility starts with a willingness to die to self and live to Christ. And all of this starts with a willingness to just put your face on the ground in front of Jesus. That's step one. Are you willing to do that? That's the hard question. Are you willing to get yourself on your face in front of Jesus? The second way she showed her devotion, Mary showed her devotion by her disregard for public perception. Her disregard for public perception. I told you we were going to come back to this, but proper women in that culture would go there. They would wear their hair up when they went out. They would not let their hair down in front of men, much less a group of men. Now, I'm looking around. I see a whole bunch of lady friends in here with their hair down. Just understand, that would be like if those Jewish men in the first century saw you like that. I'm just saying. I'm not shaming you. I'm just saying in their culture, that was like, whoa, what are you doing here? You don't, they would not do it. This would be scandalous for a woman to walk into a room where a bunch of men were and then just let her hair down. I mean, talk about how far we've devolved as a society with what we're okay with out in public, where we've gotten to the point where, like, that just seems so random, but man, the things we allow people to do today. Anyway, but this is just scandalous in those days, like to let your hair down. What? And listen, I'm not even advocating to be scandalous for the sake of being scandalous. Like, no, that's some people enjoy that. That's not what I'm saying at all. But nevertheless, it was scandalous. My point is, Mary was so focused on Jesus. She was so focused on him, it didn't even enter into her mind to worry about what the other people were thinking. It didn't even occur to her in her moment. She's having her moment of devotion with Jesus at his feet. And I don't know, maybe she just forgot the towel. Maybe the towel was in the other room. Who knows? But I do know that, she pours all this oil on his feet. There's going to be runoff. There's going to be spillage. That's a lot of oil. And as this oil is just spreading across the floor, she wasn't done humbling herself. She wasn't ready to get up yet. What does she have? I mean, some of this on my part is just conjecture, but what does she have? Her hair. She's not about to get up. Instead, she lets her hair down and uses her hair to soak up all that extra oil. That's the only way I can read this. It says she used her hair to soak up the oil. There's going to be oil all over the floor. Or maybe there was a bath. I don't know. We don't know. But the point is, that's a lot of oil. I brought a show and tell. Ironically, I preached a sermon a couple weeks ago called Show and Tell, and I didn't have any show and tell. But today I have show and tell. But anyway, this jar right here contains exactly 327 grams of olive oil. So just to get a sense of how much oil we're talking here, and maybe to you that doesn't seem like a lot, but come sit down and let me pour this on your feet, and when I'm done, then you can tell me it's not a lot. Okay, this is a good bit. And also, in case you were wondering about the price tag, in case it seemed weird to think that this much oil right here would be worth an annual salary. Let me ask you a question. How many of you dabble in essential oils? Yeah, I see some hands. I mean, you know how cheap that stuff is, right? Right. I brought another show and tell. This is Young Living's frankincense oil. This is frankincense. If you can't really see it from the back, that's kind of the point. It's really little. This is a 5-gram bottle of oil. It's frankincense. I chose the frankincense because, frankincense is in the Bible. But this is a 5-gram bottle. These things retail for like $35. It's like $35. If you want to go ahead and just do some math, and this is just the frankincense oil, but that would mean that this stuff goes for about $210 an ounce. Yeah, you would need about 6 of these to make an ounce. All right, so if I were to fill this jar, this full, with this oil, okay, so if I took the olive oil out and filled this jar to here with this oil, frankincense, this jar would be about $2,500. Just do you see how this works? I mean, it adds up pretty quickly. So, and that's just frankincense oil. Like, we're talking about like this pure spikenard from the mountains of India. I mean, this is like something that the rich people play with. So, yeah, this stuff's expensive. And this is what she just poured on his feet, by the way. So this jar full of oil. So yeah, there's going to be spillage. There's going to be all this going on. And that's what she's sopping up with her hair, is all this excess oil. She lets her hair down, and she uses that hair to soak it up. And listen, I know for a lot of us today, that probably paints a very strange picture. Is this woman on the floor wiping up oil with her hair. But let's be honest. A lot of us have done far stranger things for far less noble reasons. Okay? I mean, let's just put it all on the table. Okay? I mean, we could probably tell stories and shock each other, but we have. We have. You have. She either didn't care what the other men thought, or she just forgot about him entirely. Either way, I don't know, but either way, she's doing what she's doing. So the point is, you can't be fully devoted to Jesus if you're more worried about your public approval rating. If you're more worried about what the other people are thinking, it's always going to get in the way. So my question is, are you willing to be maligned? Are you willing to be slandered? Are you willing to be spoken poorly of on account of your faithfulness? Are you willing to face those things? Or do you hide your devotion in situations where your devotion is going to damage other people's perception of you? That's a question we have to ask. The third way is Mary showed her devotion by her offering and its high price. We already talked about how expensive this stuff is, but the cost of her offering, she showed her devotion by how much she was willing to pay. It's easy to show up in a particular building at a particular time of the morning. It is. Notice it didn't cost Judas anything to attend the dinner party. He just had to show up. But put yourselves in Mary's position. Put yourself in her shoes. You're in the presence of your Lord. He's sitting right there. And you feel compelled to make an offering for him or to him. And you ask yourself, what's something I can give him? What is something I can offer to him? And then you remember that pure oil you have. You remember that oil. Not the cheap stuff, but the good stuff, the pure stuff. Now, ask yourself, as you're listening to this message, if that's you in Mary's shoes, are you immediately overcome with the need to anoint him with your gift and just pour it all out for him? Or are you stopping first to think about how much it's going to cost? Be careful with that one. Are you ready to just give him your best? Or do you need to take a minute and count it up and see what it's going to cost you first? That's an important question. Sure, the oil's expensive. Yeah, we know that. But is it worth more than your devotion? If it was already on your heart to give him the oil, and then you remember, wait a minute, this is the good stuff, do you hesitate after you already had felt like it was on your heart to give it to him? Is it worth more than your devotion? How much are you willing to give up? How much are you willing to offer in that moment? Because if honoring Jesus, if that's your top priority, you're not going to be fazed by the price tag. You're doing it. And if that's you, you're in good company. You're in company with people like Mary in this story. You're in company with people like the guy born blind in John chapter 9, the guy who literally was excommunicated from his people and put out of the synagogue because he stood up for Jesus. You're in good company with him. You're in good company with people like JTB, the guy that said it first, he must increase, I must decrease, and then was in prison because of his faithfulness and was beheaded in prison for his faith. You want to talk about paying a high price? He found his head on a dinner platter. You're in good company with all of these people who stood up for Jesus and put their faith in Jesus. These people who are all willing to pay a very high price, a very high cost. But listen, if the cost of the oil is the major factor for you, you just might have more in common with Judas. Because that's what he was worried about. How much is this going to cost me? And cost him, it would, even though it wasn't his oil. Because remember, he was hoping to steal that money. That's what he's worried about. So when you personally have a chance to minister to somebody in need or to serve Jesus or serve the church or just whatever, when you personally have that opportunity, I guess my question is, do you first stop to consider the good that you can do as a devotion to Jesus, or are you first stopping to think about the potential cost to yourself? Is that your first concern? Is what is this going to cost me? And fun fact, I'm not just talking about money. It might cost you in other ways like time or effort, even though, let's face it, many Christians are way too stingy with their money. We're just saying. We should be the most generous people out there, but sometimes we're not. But it could also be time or effort. Here's a pro tip for you. If you want to see where your devotion is, take a look at your calendar. Take a look at the stuff that's on your planner. What's on there? What's on there? And who is it serving? That's the better question. Is it filled with a bunch of activities that serve you and enrich you and cater to you and your hobbies and your interests and your enrichment? Is that what's on your calendar? If the only information somebody had about you was what they could find when they look at your calendar, what would they say is the most important thing in your life? Good question. So your devotion may cost you time. It may cost you effort. It may cost you financially. Usually all three, if I'm just being honest with you. But listen, when true devotion is present, I would argue we gladly pay any price when there's true devotion present. Just think about the sacrifices that you have gladly made for your kids, your spouse, possibly your career, hobbies. You sacrifice things when you're devoted to them. You sacrifice things when you're devoted to something, and you do it gladly. And so today is just a really good time to ask yourself, are there things in my life right now that are keeping me from giving the Lord my full devotion? Are there things in my life right now keeping me from doing that, but I've just never been able to bring myself to give them up because the cost just seems too high? That just seems like a cost I'm not willing to pay. And so I will just allow these things to stay in my life. And so as I look at these three signs of devotion on the screen that you see there, I'm just going to kind of close out today by telling you, because this reminds me of a man that actually a Christian martyr by the name of Eric Liddell, if you've ever heard of him. And as I'm looking at these three things, I can't help but think about this guy named Eric Liddell. And he was a Christian martyr. And just let me say this. If you are not already doing this, please let me encourage you to try to read at least one good biography every year, maybe two, but at least one of a Christian martyr or a Christian hero of the faith, because I'm telling you, nothing will challenge your faith and stretch you like reading what some of these men and women were willing to do and sacrifice for their faith. I'm just saying. And Eric Liddell, I read his biography for a class a couple of years ago, and was just really impressed with him. But as I'm thinking through that list that I just had on the screen, I mean, this is a guy that checks all the boxes. This guy, he was from Britain. He was a British missionary to China, who actually, when the Japanese army was invading China in the beginning of the 1940s, he was captured while he was serving in China and put into an internment camp. And it was an internment camp where he later died while he was just in capture, while he was in prison there. And but what's interesting about, one of the things that's interesting about him is that before he became a missionary and went to China, he was an Olympic runner. He ran in the Olympics. And if you've ever heard of or seen the movie Chariots of Fire, that's a movie about his life. But Eric Liddell, he competed in the 1924 Summer Olympics, and he ran that year when the Olympics was in Paris. And so he was scheduled to run in the 100 meters, and he was the favorite. He was the favored one for that race. It was widely believed that he was going to win the gold, like no question about it. But as a devout Christian, he had this sincere conviction that he doesn't run on Sundays. Eric believed that Sunday was a day of worship and it was a day of rest. And so one of the things he was very clear about was, I won't do any kind of competitions on a Sunday. That was just his stance. I'm not suggesting that needs to be our stance necessarily, but he felt very strongly about this. This was how he knew he could honor God and show devotion to God, was by taking that day and setting it aside for rest and worship. That was just one of his convictions. And so when the Olympics published the schedules for the heats for the 100 meter to qualify for the final race, guess what day they were scheduled on? On Sunday. They scheduled it on Sunday. And so what did he say? He said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. He wouldn't budge on this. And if you want to talk about that middle point I had on the screen a minute ago about public perception, this guy went overnight. I mean, think about the pedestals we put our athletes on, right? And the pressure we put on them to compete. He went overnight from being a national hero to a pariah. The media, the journalists, all of them, they threw him under the bus. They called to, and they published articles about him. He's unpatriotic. He's selfish. He doesn't care about his country. He had royal officials from Great Britain contacting him, trying to get him to change his mind because they wanted that gold medal for Britain. And he said, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And right there, how many of us in here are thinking to yourself, come on, man, it's the Olympics. It's just one day. Just do it, man. But it wasn't just one day for him, and it wasn't the Olympics for him. It was his devotion to Christ. That was the non-negotiable in his life. That was the highest pedestal for him. And he was not willing to violate that. He said, I'm not doing it. Come what may, I'm not doing it. Now, as it happened, the 400-meter heats were scheduled as well. That schedule came out as well, and those were not scheduled for Sunday. Those were on a different day of the week. So Eric Liddell said, I'm gonna train for the 400. And just so we're clear, the 100 meter and the 400 meter are not the same thing. It's not apples to apples. Just because you're good at one does not mean you're good at the other. They're different races with different strategies and everything. In fact, not only was Eric Liddell not favored for the 400 meter, but he was like one of the underdogs. The best time he had ever posted in a 400 meter race was mediocre at best. But that was the only race that he could compete on a day that didn't violate his convictions. So he said, that's the one I'm going to do, come what may. And I'll share this because it's the coolest thing ever, but he trained and he competed in the 400. And not only did he win the gold medal, he set a world record in the process that stood for like a lot of years. And the story goes that shortly before the race, somebody slipped him a slip of paper. And on the paper, they were trying to encourage him, but on the paper, they had written down a Bible quote from 1 Samuel where it says, those who honor God, God will honor him. And he got that like as an encouragement right before the race. Now, I'm not suggesting he won the race because he was sticking to his convictions. Maybe, but I'm not suggesting that necessarily. But it is a cool little detail in the story. But I mean, think about the three things I just had on that screen, right? To humble yourself. You know, he was willing to put his own aspirations and his own dreams at the bottom of the list for the sake of his convictions. The public perception, he didn't care what they said about him. He was sticking to his guns, and the willingness to just put himself last. The willingness to not even to just be at the bottom, to die to self. Just it was all there for him. It was all there for him. But here's the thing. What Eric Liddell did should not seem extreme or radical to us. It shouldn't. His level of devotion should be the standard. That should be standard. The fact that it seems radical and it seems extreme is actually more of an indictment about how casual modern Christianity has become. That this seems abnormal to us. That so many people think it's possible to be a Christian without any actual devotion to Jesus. That we can just call ourselves by a name and say, well, I'm a Christian, but not actually have any devotion to this person that ironically we call Lord. And when it's all said and done, how many of us are actually like Mary? When it's all said and done, and we're just willing to plant, who was willing to plant herself on her face at the feet of Jesus and pay any cost for him. But then you ask yourself, how many Judases are running around? How many of us are more like Judas, trying to calculate what is the least amount of time, effort, and price that we can get by with without it impacting our real lives too much? We got to ask these hard questions. There are just way too many ways that Christians today compromise their values and put Jesus down at the bottom. All the while telling themselves, you know, we're doing a good job because, hey, at least we came to church. At least we showed up. Well, so did Judas. Judas showed up for church. And you couldn't miss Judas because he was the guy off to the side with the big mouth, complaining about all the things he didn't like. It fit in great in a lot of churches. That's who he was. Mary? You might have missed Mary. If you had walked into the room at that moment, you might not have even known she was there at first. Why? Because you couldn't see her face. She was the one down on the floor in front of Jesus, putting her devotion over distance. That's my challenge today. Is we got to take a good, hard, long look at who we are in this story. Are we just here physically, or are we here in full devotion?